Welcome to this week's Subset of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is going to be the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime and the latest aggressions there 2 days ago. We're going to follow that up by covering the big story of the week, which was the Prigozhin affair or attempted coup or uprising in Russia. And we're going to close with the ongoing negotiations in Washington, D.C. right now between Armenia, the United States, and the regime in Baku. Let's start off with the latest aggressions in Artsakh. For the past week, there's been almost daily shootings by the Aliyev regime at mostly at civilians and sometimes at military positions in Artsakh, all of them initiated by them and started by them. And this is usually a sign of an escalation to come. And yesterday we had the escalation where they had an attack that was led by drones and artillery that led to the murder of 4 Artsakh servicemen. Their names are Arno Abkaryan, Samvel Torosyan, Yervan Tatevosyan, and Gagik Balayan. And I think it's actually important to name these people. These are not faceless people. They have families, they have loved ones. And it's also important to note that they were murdered for one reason and one reason alone, and that was their ethnicity and religion. Now, why this aggression and why now? I think there's essentially two likely reasons for it. The first one is this constant drumbeat of aggression. I mean, the Moloch in Baku has to live off of or feed off of Armenian blood, otherwise his regime really has trouble continuing, so these aggressions have to continue. And on the second level, I think they're designed to intimidate us in the ongoing negotiations in Washington, D.C., and that most likely is something that's going to fail. Moving on to the blockade itself, it's actually continuing. We're almost on the 200th day of it. What the regime did this week, they actually added to the blockade by adding concrete barriers that were put all over the road, the bridge that connects Armenia with Artsakh. There was one helicopter resupply of medical supplies by the Russian peacekeepers for medical, emergency medical supplies. The ICRC has been blocked for 2 weeks from taking any food or any medications into Artsakh. They were, however, able to, on a one-time basis, transfer some patients in and out of Artsakh. Let's move on to the second topic of this week, which is the topic that dominated the weekend, which is the Prigozhin Rebellion against the government of Russia, the Putin government. All of this started with a speech that Prigozhin made attacking the Russian leadership, specifically the military leadership, questioning the reasons why the war started. And he's been doing this, questioning the conduct of the war. Now, what motivates him to do this is very hard to know, because this is a man who's probably just as much interested in money as in power. So we really don't know exactly what led to this. And I think we need to be modest in our analysis. There's a lot more that we don't know than we do know. Now, who is Prigozhin? Prigozhin is a former criminal in Soviet times and who, after he was freed, essentially became a hot dog vendor, then a famous caterer, who was actually a caterer to Vladimir Putin, and eventually the operator of the Wagner Group, which is a mercenary company that is closely tied to the Russian state. In response to this, Putin made a speech on Saturday morning, essentially calling this out as a rebellion and essentially saying that the state is going to fight against him and put this rebellion down. And he actually made some interesting analogies. He brought this back to 1917 about how Russia was stabbed in the back by the Bolsheviks. In this case, I guess it makes him Tsar Nicholas II and makes Prigozhin Lenin or Trotsky, which only proves the old adage from Marx that in history, everything happens twice. The first time is tragedy and the second time is farce. Now, what happened later on that day, Prigozhin backed down, essentially, and it's a deal that was made by the Belarusian President Lukashenko, which involved him and his forces either joining the army or moving to Belarus. But in trying to understand this, what happened, this was really not a military coup. Coups tend to be far more organized. They tend to be done from the center. This is more of an uprising by a military chieftain from a peripheral stronghold that was challenging the current leadership. Now, what really stood out that day, which was quite noticeable, is that in the hours that this was going on, very few people came to the defense of the regime. In fact, this armed column that was marching from Rostov towards Moscow, shooting down Russian Air Force planes as they go. I think they ended up killing 12 pilots in the process of moving. Essentially, no one was trying to stop them, which probably means that there were some state actors that were probably either watching this or had some role in it. What's also impressive, despite the fact that Wagner Group are essentially a criminal organization, is you had 25,000 people, or at least thousands of his troops that were willing to become mutineers based on one man's orders. That's probably the kind of loyalty that very few generals around the world have. So that's actually quite interesting and impressive. What happened during these few hours was quite interesting. You had a lot of the oligarchs, Rothenberg being the most prime example, who were actually flying with their private jets to Baku, while at the same time the Russian middle class was essentially escaping to wherever they could. In Yerevan, we got large numbers of them, and apparently flights to Yerevan that day went from somewhere in the $200 range for one way to somewhere between $1,500 to $2,500, depending on what time period people were buying their tickets. And lastly, as much as Prigozhin was marching without any help, at the same time, no one from the elite actually joined him in this process, which means that if this was any kind of a semi-coup attempt, it was not particularly well planned. Now, I think what's likely to happen, we're essentially looking at two scenarios. The first one is that there's likely to be just a massive purge, some kind of a Stalinist purge, where essentially everyone's loyalties who we tested are going to be arrested and sidelined by the Putin government. And if they don't do that, I think what we're going to have is that sometime in the near future, there will be a far more organized effort that probably has a greater part of the elite that will succeed in doing what Prigozhin failed last Saturday. But what does this mean for us? It means likely a couple of things, probably a further decline in Russian influence in this region, and a stronger Western influence as the West fills in the vacuum of this collapsing Russian power structure. We're likely to see another wave of, massive wave of Russian immigration to Armenia, a process that's been continuing for a year and a half. This is something that's likely to further strengthen Armenia's pivot to the West, especially given that Russia is distracted. And most importantly, I think this is the type of thing that actually scares the hell out of people like Aliyev, is because if this could happen to someone who's far more stronger and far more formidable like Putin, he must be thinking that someday at some point there's going to be some Russian Turkish-backed general that's going to park his tank in front of his palace, and what is he going to do then? Which means that we're going to be dealing with an Aliyev that is far more scared, paranoid, and insecure about his position. Now let's move on to the last topic of the week, which is the summit in D.C. Right now, as we sit here, there's actually very intense negotiations going on in D.C. between the three sides, between the United States, the Republic of Armenia, and the regime in Baku. I think since we don't know too much about what's being discussed or what's going to come out of it, I think it's important to have some kind of a background about what brought us to this moment, because frankly, this is a very confusing process, multi-dimensional, multi-countries. All of this, frankly, can be said started in last year. There was a Russian proposal that essentially wanted to freeze the status issue of Artsakh for the next 20, 25 years, and this was obviously the Russians' way of staying there forever, while opening up the borders, recognition of borders, and all the rest of that. And this was a proposal that was rejected by the regime in Baku. Aliyev actually much preferred the Western format at that time, precisely for one reason, because he knew that the West would push the Armenian government to recognize Artsakh within the context of Aliyev's own territorial integrity. He, at the same time, was confident that the Armenian government will never accept that. And then with them never accepting that, it would essentially keep the current status quo, where he can constantly do his aggressions and say, look, they have claims on my territory and I have to respond. What has happened since then, in a sense, he's actually regretted his decision of going for the Western format over the Russian one. And let me explain why. What has changed, and the reason that Aliyev right now regrets his decision to go with the Western format, is since that decision was made by him, there's been an absolute deepening of the Baku-Moscow-Ankara relationship. Baku is deeply involved in laundering oil and gas to the West for Russia. And given that Russia actually at this point needs Azerbaijan and Turkey a lot more than the other way around, you have a Russia that can be mollified in all the things that those two countries want and can be pushed to allow things that they normally wouldn't, i.e. the illegal blockade and half a dozen different things. The other thing which Aliyev did not figure is that his aggressions in September would create a far stronger Armenian pivot towards the West. And he underestimated to the extent that Armenian-Russian relations can deteriorate, and this is something that actually gives him a freer hand in what he needs to do. So right now, in the current context, he's left with a choice, given the fact that the West is telling him that we have gotten Armenia to commit to everything that you want. You have no reason to not to sign this peace deal. And he's constantly looking at different ways. And obviously the aggressions this week are a way for him to come out of this conundrum. Because ultimately, the problem for him is that all of these peace deals involve direct negotiations between Baku and Stepanakert and the guarantee of rights and securities of people in Artsakh, which is something that he's absolutely not interested in. And the current status quo with a Russia that is very much aligned with him in their aggressions against the people of of Artsakh and the people of Armenia is a far more favorable ally than a problematic Western presence in this region. In conclusion, what is this likely to all lead to? Ultimately, the most likely scenario is that Aliyev will walk away from this Western deal because currently the current Russian status quo is far more favorable to him. It allows what he wants, which is this drip, constant aggression and ethnic cleansing out of Artsakh without him having any international responsibilities. But at the same time, he'll be very much interested in keeping the process part of the peace process going, i.e. you keep having pointless conversations that lead to nothing, which I think is important for us to actually put a frame to this, that this cannot go on forever. While this is going on, he's obviously going to pocket what the West got him, which is for Armenia to recognize Artsakh as part of Aliyev's own territory. And I think his basic calculation is actually a correct one, which is that when the push comes to shove, there will be not that great of a punishment if he actually walks away from a deal and keeps the current status quo. Thank you for joining me. This week's episode of Insights.
I want you to find out what an open pimp to tie his high man on his ass now, right now.
Hey, Sonny, what? Things are starting to loosen up a little bit. If you go after Talia, all hell's gonna break loose. Let the smoke clear. Pop can negotiate.
No, Pop can't do nothing till he's better. I'm gonna decide what's gonna be.
All right, but your war's costing us a lot of money. Nothing's coming in. We can't do business.
Well, neither can they. Don't
They
worry
don't
about
have
it.
our
Please
overhead.
don't worry about
We
it.
can't afford a stalemate.
Well, then there ain't no more stalemate. I'm gonna end it by killing that old bastard. I'm gonna
Yeah, you're getting
kill
a
him.
great reputation. I hope you're enjoying
Well,
it.
you just do what I tell you to do. God damn it, if I had a wartime consigliere of Sicilian, I wouldn't be in this shape.